Annie Besant, née Wood, born October 1st, 1847, London, England, died September 20th, 1933. Adya, Madras, now in Tamil Nadu, India, British social reformer, sometime Fabian socialist, theosophist, and Indian independence leader. Besant had been the wife of an Anglican clergyman. They separated in 1873, and Besant became associated for many years with the atheist and social reformer Charles Bradlaugh. She was an early advocate of birth control, and in the late 1880s she became a prominent Fabian socialist under the influence of George Bernard Shaw. Finally, in 1889, she was converted to the doctrines of the Russian-born religious mystic Helena Blavatsky, a co-founder of the Theosophical Society. The teachings of the society emphasized human service, a spiritual evolutionism drawn from both Eastern and Western esoteric philosophy, and the role of superhuman masters of wisdom. Besant plunged vigorously into theosophical work, lecturing and writing widely. Her numerous books and articles are still considered among the best expositions of theosophical belief. She was international president of the Theosophical Society from 1907 until her death, residing principally at its headquarters in Madras. She was active in educational and humanitarian work in India and became involved in the Indian independence movement, establishing the Indian Home Rule League in 1916. She promoted her protégé, Jiddu Krishnamurti, whom she believed to be a potential world teacher, in the years before his renunciation of formal theosophy in 1929.
We're each on a unique spiritual path. While our paths may differ on the surface, there are truths and values we all share. Truths that transcend our religions, philosophies, and traditions. Values that support an open and connected community. At the Theosophical Society in America, we seek with open minds, respect the unity of all life, transform through inner awareness. Since 1875, we have not wavered in our mission to uplift the consciousness of humanity. Today, we're working harder than ever to uphold these sacred values by offering resources that span all spiritual paths.
The modern Republic of India was born in 1947. But the country had been awakened 50 years earlier, above all by a somewhat eccentric Englishwoman of whom it's been said that no single person did so much to revive the Hindu's pride in his religious heritage as she. She was Annie Besant, whose strange career began in the 1870s. Born Annie Wood, the daughter of a poor but genteel widow, she'd been given only a meagre education. At 19, full of devotion to Christ and desire to serve, she had done what everyone assured her was the obvious thing. She married a clergyman, Frank Besant, and went with him to a country parish in Lincolnshire. In the villages around Sibsey, she encountered the terrible sufferings of the rural poor.
In one cottage, I'd found 4 generations sleeping in one room. The great-grandfather and his wife, the unmarried grandmother, the unmarried mother, the little child. And 3 men lodgers completed the tale of 8 human beings crowded into that narrow, ill-ventilated garret. Other cottages were hovels, through the broken roofs of which poured the rain, and wherein rheumatism and ague lived with the human dwellers. How could I do aught but sympathize with any combination of workers that aimed at the raising of these poor?
The conditions of the poor, and then the long and distressing illness of her own first child, undermined her belief in the justice of life. In addition, her husband appears to have been a brute, and her marriage was failing. Annie Besant began to lose her faith.
The agony of the struggle was in the first 19 months. No one who has not felt it knows the fearful anguish inflicted by doubt on the earnestly religious soul. It seems to shipwreck everything. Is all blind chance? Is all the clash of unconscious forces? Or are we the sentient toys of an almighty power that sports with our agony?
Annie Besant had an active, inquiring spirit. She wanted answers, she wanted activity. The narrowness and frustration of a married woman's life in a remote country village at that time was intolerable to her. She worried about the Bible, she worried about human suffering, about Christ's punishment, about hell. By reading liberal theologians, she managed to ease herself out of the harsh, old evangelical beliefs she'd been brought up in. But the respite was only temporary. Her thoughts at this time were moving in a humanist direction. One day she locked herself in the church and then, feeling rather foolish, climbed the pulpit to try out her speaking voice. What had she to say?
What is your hope? A heaven in the clouds? I point to a heaven attainable on earth. What? You serve warmly a God unknown and invisible, in a sense only the projected shadow of your own imaginings, and can only serve coldly your brother whom you see at your side. If you want inspiration to feeling, to sentiment, perhaps you'd better keep to your Bible and your creeds. But if you want inspiration to work, go and walk through the east of London or the back streets of Manchester. You're inspired to tenderness as you gaze at the wounds of Jesus dead in Judea long ago. And yet you find no inspiration in the wounds of men and women dying in the England of today. I offer you ideals for your homage. Here is truth for your mistress, to whose exaltation you shall devote your intellect. Here is freedom for your general, for whose I shall never forget the feeling of power and of delight which came upon me as my voice rolled down the aisles and the passion in me broke into balanced sentences. I felt that all I wanted was to see the church full of upturned faces instead of the emptiness of the silent pews. And as though in a dream, the solitude became peopled, and I saw the listening faces and the eager eyes. And as the sentences came unbidden from my lips and my own tones echoed back to me from the pillars of the ancient church, I knew of a verity, that the gift of speech was mine.
Only a century ago, it was still very difficult for a woman to imagine that she could be a public speaker. A few months later, the crisis came. Annie Besant, the vicar's wife, sitting here, did not go up to receive communion, but stood and walked out of the church instead. This was scandalous and open revolt, because any wife, but above all a vicar's wife, was of course expected to be entirely behind her husband. So there was an ultimatum. She must conform or she must leave home. But now it was far too late to bring her back into line. By the end of 1873, at the age of 26, Mrs. Besant was legally separated from her husband and living in poverty with her 2 babies in Upper Norwood, London. Now her energies were released. She joined the National Secular Society and met Charles Bradlaugh, the celebrated atheist campaigner. She became co-editor with Bradlaugh of his newspaper, published from this address in Fleet Street. It's still a newspaper office today.
Okay. Cheers.
Annie Besant's activity as a militant atheist campaigner was phenomenal. She was assailed at public meetings all over the country, and she poured out tracts and articles. Her interest in marriage and the condition of women led to the famous test case on the right to publish birth control information, which she and Bradlaugh fought before the Lord Chief Justice in 1877. They won on appeal, but it cost her the custody of her children, for another court ruled that her views made her unfit to care for them. With Bradlaugh, she also fought the long legal battles over his admission to Parliament, and in those same years, she managed to read a science degree at London University. She was a fighter. Annie Besant was already moving away from Bradlaugh's rather sectarian atheism. She was now an active socialist. She was in the bloody demonstration in Trafalgar Square on November the 13th, 1877, when socialist marchers were met by mounted police and guardsmen with fixed bayonets. Still, Annie Besant's unquiet spirit was not at rest. Perhaps her militant atheism and socialism had taken her too far from her mother and her upbringing. At any rate, she was already dabbling in spiritualism when, one day in 1889, a book came in for her to review. It was H.P. Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine. She was ripe for conversion.
I was sitting alone at my desk in the Reformer office, immersed in a deep but nearly hopeless longing to solve the riddle of life and mind, when I heard a voice speaking to me. I could see nobody, but the voice said, "Are you willing to give up everything for the sake of truth?" I didn't challenge him or ask questions. I wanted the truth, that was the fact. I was longing to have it intensely. So I went head over heels into the secret doctrine. I'm immersed in Madame Blavatsky. If I perish in the attempt to review her, you must write on my tomb, "She has gone to investigate the secret doctrine at first hand."
Mrs. Besant's conversion to Theosophy astonished the public. Theosophists believe that Madame Blavatsky was telepathically guided by Tibetan masters, and Annie herself came to think she'd been a Hindu in a previous life. How had she jumped from atheism and socialism straight into such ideas? Well, Theosophy was very vigorous and attractive. It appealed to people who were in revolt against narrow, outworn creeds. It offered them a higher teaching, the wisdom of the East, an ancient universal truth that underlay all religions alike. And this was just what Annie wanted. Now, in those paradoxical days when so many of the British were looking to India for religious inspiration, talented young Indians were being sent to Britain to learn the ways of their imperial rulers. In 1890, the two groups met. Gandhi was a young law student in London.
Towards the end of my second year in England, I met two Theosophists. They introduced me to Madame Blavatsky and Mrs. Besant. The latter had just joined the Theosophical Society, and I was following with great interest the controversy about her conversion. I also read The Key to Theosophy, which stimulated me to read books on Hinduism, and disabused me of the notion fostered by the missionaries that Hinduism was rife with superstition.
Gandhi was profoundly influenced all his life by the teaching of Jesus, especially his concern for the deprived. But when he and Mrs. Besant went to India, they went as apostles not of Christianity and British culture, but of a renaissance of Hinduism. Her 30 years campaigning there prepared the way for his eventual triumph.
Besant moved Helena Blavatsky into her home and helped Blavatsky co-edit her publication Lucifer, which was a journal originally published in London by Helena Blavatsky in September 1887. The journal published articles on philosophical, theosophical, scientific, and religious topics. It also contained book reviews, for example, of Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The first issues were co-edited with Mabel Collins, from 1889 until Blavatsky's death in May 1891. Annie Besant then published the journal until September 1895, when George Robert Stonemead became a co-editor. The journal appeared 12 times a year and was 80 to 90 pages long. The last of 20 volumes was published in August 1897. More than 2,800 articles were published in this journal between 1887 and 1897. Then the journal was renamed to the Theosophical Review, which was published in London with Annie Besant and G.R.S. Mead as the editors, as the organ of the Theosophical Society in Europe. During this time, Besant began developing psychic abilities with fellow Theosophical Society member C.W. Leadbeater, who she would go on to write 2 books with, Occult Chemistry and Thought Forms, both of which are still in publication today. Besant also represented Theosophy at the Chicago World Fair and received much praise. In 1906, critics were angered to learn that Leadbeater had given advice to boys under his care that encouraged masturbation as a way to relieve obsessive sexual thoughts. Leadbeater acknowledged that he had given this advice to a few boys approaching maturity who came to him for help. He commented,
"I know that the whole question of sex feelings is the principal difficulty in the path of boys and girls, and very much harm is done by the prevalent habit of ignoring the subject and fearing to speak of it to young people. The first information about it should come from parents or friends, not from servants or bad companions."
The revelations regarding Leadbeater's advice prompted several members of the Theosophical Society to ask for his resignation. The society held proceedings against him in 1906. Annie Besant, elected president of the society in 1907, later stated in his defense,
The so-called trial of Mr. Leadbeater was a travesty of justice. He came before judges, one of whom had declared beforehand that he ought to be shot. Another, before hearing him, had written passionate denunciations of him. A third and fourth had accepted, on purely psychic testimony, unsupported by any evidence, the view that he was grossly immoral and a danger to the society.
Charges of misconduct that went beyond the advice he admitted giving were never proven. He nevertheless resigned. After Colonel Henry Steele Olcott died in 1907, Annie Besant became president of the society following a political struggle. By the end of 1908, the international sections voted for Leadbeater's readmission. He accepted and came to Adyar on the 10th of February 1909. At the time, Besant referred to Leadbeater as a martyr who was wronged by her and by the Theosophical Society, saying that never again would a shadow come between her and her brother initiate. In 1909, C.W. Leadbeater discovered 12-year-old Jiddu Krishnamurti near Madras and was taken under the wing of Annie Besant and the Theosophical Society, along with his younger brother Nityananda. Leadbeater believed that Jiddu was destined to be a world teacher, was to take on the spirit of Maitreya, who would prepare humanity for a higher evolution. The Theosophical Society believes that Jesus of Nazareth had been trained for the same purpose by the Essenes, in order to be possessed by the very same spirit Maitreya, who they called Christ. According to Osho, aka Sri Rajneesh, recorded in the book Hayakujo, the Everest of Zen with Basho's haikus, he states, "One of the great difficulties with Leadbeater was he was a homosexual, and he abused every child, including J. Krishnamurti. There was a case against Leadbeater in Madras High Court. When the father of these two children, he was a poor man, a poor clerk whose wife had died, and so he was in trouble about how to manage these two boys in his office. So when Leadbeater proposed the idea that Annie Besant could adopt them, the father was very happy. Annie Besant was a world-famous woman. He gave the adoption to Annie Besant, but it was discovered by many people that those small children had been sexually abused by Leadbeater. So the man appealed to the High Court. "I want my children returned to me. They are being homosexually abused by Leadbeater." To avoid the situation, the judge was ready to return the children because there were witnesses of this abuse. Annie Besant, being a very famous British woman, managed to smuggle all those children to England before the court orders were passed. This was easy for her because India was under British rule, and Annie Besant was a powerful woman. So she managed to take the children out of the country. Then, when the magistrate's orders were issued, saying that the children should be returned, the children were not there. She did not put those children, J. Krishnamurti included, into any state school. This was such a guarded phenomenon. In a public school, he may have started smoking. He may have started behaving like ordinary students. He was kept almost a prisoner. Private tutors were teaching him, and all kinds of nonsense, religious, scriptural, was forced upon him. All this created a situation in which he revolted. A day was appointed when they were going to declare him as a world teacher, enlightened. In Holland, 6,000 representatives of the Theosophical movement fathered from all over the world. And at the last moment, when he was going to declare it, he stood up and said, "I am not a world teacher, and I refuse to be the head of any organization." A special organization, the Star of the East, was created for him, which would work for the world teacher. It was a section of the Theosophical movement.
The Adventures of Young Indiana Jones, Journey of Radiance, created by George Lucas, 2000. In January 1910, the Jones family attends a meeting of the Theosophical movement in Benares, India. There, young Indy befriends the young Jiddu Krishnamurti and meets Charles Leadbeater and Annie Besant. George Lucas stated in an interview that he saw Star Wars as a means of conveying spiritual and moral ideas to youth in a modern age, as per inspiration from Joseph Campbell. The perspective on religions in this film depicts the pluralistic culture of India and Annie Besant's diplomatic approach to the relationship between people of different religion. In this story, the experience is very important and greatly impresses the young Indiana Jones. It depicts Charles W. Leadbeater as a kind of Rasputin character and addresses the fact there was another boy lined up to have the role of world teacher, later assigned to J. Krishnamurti.
Would you like to play?
Sure. Wait a minute. I'm supposed to be studying.
So am I.
Great.
You can play on my team. What is your name?
Well, my parents call me Henry, but you can call me Indy.
Jiddu Krishnamurti. This is my brother, Jiddu Nitya.
I believe you all know Mr. Charles Leadbeater. Charles.
Thank you, President Besant. I wish first to express the Society's gratitude for the generous donations offered tonight by two of our newest members, Mr. Mukherjee of Calcutta and Mr. Richard McCallum, just arrived from Edinburgh. It is always a momentous occasion when the spiritual powers send one of their own to teach us the way. So it was with Sri Krishna in the 4th century BC. So it was with Jesus Christ in the 1st century AD. The coming of a new world teacher has been prophesied for some time.
Both Lucifer and Lucis come from the same word root, Lucis being the Latin generative case meaning of light. Like the great teacher H.P. Blavatsky, sought to elicit a deeper understanding of the sacrifice made by Lucifer. Theosophy, a spiritual tradition which views Lucifer as one of the solar angels, those advanced beings who Theosophy says descended, thus the fall, from Venus to our planet eons ago to bring the principle of mind to what was then animal man. In the theosophical perspective, the descent of these solar angels was not a fall into sin or disgrace, but rather an act of great sacrifice. as is suggested in the name Lucifer, which means light bearer.
One of the most controversial practices of the Jedi was their method of growing their order, through almost exclusively adding new members when they were mere infants, many of which were taken from their consenting parents after the Jedi convinced them that their baby would live a better life under their guidance. So what did the Jedi do with the newborns once they got back to the temple?
Krishnamurti, how old were you when you first heard about the Theosophists' plans for you?
Must have been about 10, I don't remember exactly.
You don't remember how it felt at the time?
No, not at all.
Did you really believe that you were the chosen
may
one?
I tell you something? When they found us, we were a very poor family and all the rest of it, Brahmins. And I'm afraid I can't tell you with direct memory because I don't remember it actually. I'm not pretending, I'm just stating facts. I believe when they found us, we were very weak. And one of the principal people who found us said, he's going to be the great teacher and so on, so on, so on. They formed an organization around me. I was the head of it, and thousands of members, money, all the business of it.
They didn't use any drugs or hypnosis or anything like that?
Goodness sake, no. They are not that kind of people. They were very, very serious. They weren't charlatans. They weren't using a good old gimmick or trick to exploit people. They really, please believe me, sincerely believed what they were doing. It wasn't just a hoax. It wasn't to exploit people. They staked all their reputation, all their work, everything on this boy. So there was no question of drugs or hypnosis or suggestions made. They said, this boy is going to be used by the great teacher in whom they believed absolutely.
And why did they believe this? Why did they believe that you had been chosen?
Because they were clairvoyant.
They really were?
Probably they were. At the time they discovered the boy, they certainly must have been. Because they said, this boy is going to be the great teacher. His body will be used. It's not a question of your belief. I'm just telling you what they sincerely, honestly, and deeply believed. They believed because they said, this happens every 2,000 or whatever years. A great teacher appears on earth when the world is in chaos. And he will give new kind of teachings and so on. That's their fundamental, radical belief.
They had some sort of occult instructions?
Yes, instructions, which they believed and they followed it.
And you did too, of course, at first. But when did you first have doubts about the pattern they'd done?
You see, I never had doubts. Forgive me using that word. You see, the boy must have been very vague and not all there, if I can put it that way. I think he must have been a very dreamy boy. And so whatever they said didn't deeply penetrate. You see, they had been looking for a number of years from what people have told me, for a boy. They had already brought an American boy to India, I believe. And the moment they saw me, they dropped him. Because they said, this is the boy we've been looking for. For 2 years, they watched over this boy and his brother, gave him right kind of food and all that, brought him to Europe, educated him. Nothing penetrated deeply. Only and they had built a tremendous organization around this boy. It wasn't just for money, for exploitation or anything, but please, you have to be convinced they really believed what they were doing. So when this boy began to talk, he said organizations are not the way to truth, and dissolved it.
You just, out of the blue, decided that you didn't want to have anything more to do with this particular program, as it were?
No, with any religious organization. Because it then becomes another sect, another division in the religious structure of man, and so that's all wrong. to divide people into Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, and all the rest of it. It seems so absurd.
This is a strange thing that you should have come to this conclusion. You must have studied a great deal.
No, I haven't. If I may again say simply and very honestly, I don't read any philosophy, any religious books. I read weekly news magazine and occasionally a detective story. But otherwise, I'm not a reader.
It must have been a great blow to the Theosophical Society because it claimed this occult authority, and also to those who expected the coming of the world teacher. Well, did the society close down then?
On the contrary, it's going on.
It's still going on?
Oh, yeah, of course.
And when you dissolved the Order of the Star of the East, you didn't wish to set up a rival cult, obviously.
God, I didn't want to
have anything to do with it.
With any cult.
But you still believe that you have a lot to teach.
I don't believe, I do it.
Oh, well, what is the purpose of your mission to Australia?
First of all, they have asked me to go there. And I don't go unless invited because I have no money. I don't possess, I don't want to, go into all that kind of thing. So when they asked me, they've been asking me for several years to go.
And you'll be giving talks there?
Probably, discussions, talks.
People will undoubtedly come to you with some of their problems to discuss with you. Do you welcome that sort of thing?
I don't welcome or not welcome. If they want to see me, they'll see me. If they don't, they don't. I don't want to impress anybody. I want really totally anonymous. It is the personal cult and all that rubbish.
Of course, this is going to be a rather impertinent question, I'm afraid.
Please,
but Australians of my generation may associate you with that amphitheatre the Theosophists built at Balmoral, from which believers who'd bought seats could witness the second coming. At least that's what the paper said. Is that what actually happened?
I believe so.
That was after your time, though, was it?
No, I don't remember exactly. There was I think it must have been around 25, 26 or 27. I don't remember exactly. They started something of that kind. But when I dissolved before all that kind of thing, they said, Lord.
Of course, that helped to rather discredit the society.
No, you see, sir, you must keep the two things clear. The society was one thing and the Order of the Star was in the other. The society believed in brotherhood and all that kind of stuff, and the Order of the Star expressly believed that they would follow what the teacher would say. So when that was dissolved, the Theosophical Society went on. What an autobiography. What's that?
I think it would complete the whole account if you gave some brief account.
Yeah.
Then we would all be doing the same thing.
Oh, Lord. I'm going to talk to you, sir. My brother and I were found by Dr. Besant. We were Brahmin boys, what Brahmins were. About 100 years ago, they were very traditional, very orthodox, tremendously religious in the orthodox sense. And Dr. Besant and others said, that boy who's the older, which was myself, they said, that boy is going to be a great world teacher. At that age, there were 9 of us probably. And they formed a tremendous organization around me. I was the head of it. Members all over the world, hundreds of thousands, with a great deal of property, money. And in 1925, I said, this is all wrong. It'll be another racket. And I dissolved it. Returned the property, returned the money, everything. I'll tell you something. It's personal, but it doesn't matter. I was born in India. And I was adopted by people and made head of a tremendous organization as a boy. Understand? About your age, 15, 14, less than that. And they said I was a great teacher, I was going to be. So people began to worship the person, you understand? Put candles around him, garlands, we have no idea anything. So the boy could have built an image about himself, couldn't he? Do you understand what I'm saying? And if that image was attacked, he would be hurt, wouldn't he? Huh? Are you following all this? So, he never had an image. Never. They said he was a great teacher, he was a Messiah, he was, etc. I have no idea what it was all like. Tremendous.
What's the secret that this boy doesn't have an image? And other boy maybe has.
Look at this guy. What is the secret? He didn't have it. There is no secret.